3 days after I gave birth, my mother-in-law announced, "This baby can't be our blood." The room went silent. My husband looked confused. I just smiled, because I'd already ordered a test that would ruin her. 3 days after I gave birth, my mother-in-law held my daughter like she was trying to solve her. She turned Luna sideways, tilted her toward the window light, and studied her the way you'd study a receipt you suspected was wrong. Then she looked up, and she said it loud enough for the nurses station to hear. "This baby can't be our blood." The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet right before something breaks. My husband's face went blank, not shocked, not angry, just blank, like a screen that's lost signal. Diane stood there in her cream blazer and her pearls, waiting for someone to argue with her. I just smiled. "I'm Thea Caldwell. I'm 35 years old. I've spent 12 years as a genetic counselor, which means I've spent 12 years reading what blood actually says, translating it for people who are terrified of the answer." Diane never once considered that the woman she'd been circling for 4 years was the one person in that hospital room who actually knew how to answer her question. She just didn't know I already had. I'd been married to Daniel Caldwell for 3 years when Luna was born, and married into Diane for exactly that long too, because you don't marry a Caldwell. You get absorbed by one. Old money, 4 generations of it. The kind that doesn't announce itself with anything loud, just with the way Diane paused before she said your name, like she was deciding whether you'd earned the right to it yet. Daniel's father, Robert, had been a circuit court judge for 26 years before he passed. There was a portrait of him in the front hallway of the Caldwell house, gavel resting on a leather blotter, and Diane dusted the frame herself every Sunday. She had pearls that had come down through 4 generations of Caldwell women, and she told me once, early on, apropos of nothing, that they were only for blood. I remember laughing because I thought she was joking. She wasn't looking at the pearls when she said it. She was looking at me. That should have been the first red flag. I filed it under eccentric rich mother-in-law instead, because that's what you do when you love someone and you want his family to love you back. You build excuses out of hope. Diane had been measuring me since the day Daniel brought me home to meet her, measuring my vowels, my table manners, the label on my coat. I passed most of her tests without knowing I was taking them. I didn't pass the ones that mattered because those tests weren't about me. I understand that now. I didn't understand it at 28, sitting at her dining table for the first time, watching her eyes move down my hands like she was checking a manicure for a wedding I hadn't been invited to yet. 4 hours after Luna was born, Diane came to the hospital with a gift bag and a look on her face I mistook for excitement. She picked Luna up before she asked, which I noted and let go, because that's a small thing, and I was exhausted and stitched and happier than I'd ever been in my life. She held my daughter up toward the fluorescent light like she was checking a stone for flaws. "She's dark," Diane said. "Caldwell babies are fair." Daniel laughed it off, nervous, quick, the kind of laugh you use to paper over a crack in the wall before anyone else notices it's there. "Mom, she's 3 hours old. Babies change color for weeks." Diane didn't laugh. She set Luna back in the bassinet with a gentleness that felt almost worse than roughness would have, because it was so deliberate, and she said 2 words on her way out the door. "We'll see." I told myself it was nothing. Grief does strange things to people, and Diane had lost Robert 18 months earlier. Maybe this was some twisted version of missing him, looking for him in a baby who couldn't possibly carry his face yet. I told Daniel that in the parking garage that night, trying to build the excuse for both of us. He nodded like he wanted to believe it too. The nurse who'd been on shift that afternoon, a woman named Patrice who'd been doing postpartum care for 11 years, caught my eye on her way out of the room. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The look was enough. The look people give you when they've seen this particular kind of cruelty before, and know better than to name it out loud in front of the person doing it. I found out later she'd noted the comment in her shift log anyway, out of habit. The way hospital staff quietly document things that might matter someday, even when nobody's asked them to. I didn't know yet that it would matter. I just knew my chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with the delivery. I want to be honest about something, because this story only works if I am. I am not from where the Caldwells are from. My mother is half Filipina. My father is white. I have a complexion that shifts with the season, and Luna came out with warm brown skin and a head of dark hair, and somewhere in Diane's mind, that math didn't add up to blood. It added up to doubt. And doubt, once it's given a seat at the table, doesn't leave when you ask it to. The whispers started within a week. My sister-in-law Brooke, Daniel's younger sister, 29, recently divorced, and I'd learn later, deeply invested in staying the favorite child, told half the county I'd been working late in the months before Luna was born. I hadn't. I'd been doing exactly what my calendar said I was doing, seeing patients at the genetics clinic on 5th and Larkspur, 3 days a week, home by 6 every single one of them. But a rumor doesn't need a calendar. It just needs a mouth willing to say it and an audience willing to want it to be true. Diane began texting Daniel things that were clearly meant for me to see over his shoulder. "There's no shame in certainty, Danny, only in pretending not to want it." I read that one standing at the kitchen island with Luna asleep against my chest, and my hands went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. By the time Daniel's college friend Marcus called him, awkward, apologetic, saying he'd heard some things going around and wanted Danny to hear it from a friend first, the affair rumor had a shape of its own, walking around the county without me, introducing itself at dinner parties I hadn't been invited to. Nobody said it to my face. That's the cruelest part of a whisper campaign. It doesn't need your participation. It just needs your absence. I started keeping things. Not because I had a plan yet. I want to be clear about that, because this isn't a story about me being 3 steps ahead the whole time. I kept things because 12 years of genetic counseling teaches you that documentation is the only thing that survives a dispute about truth. Screenshots, dates, a folder on my laptop I named, with a bitterness I'm not proud of, Diane. I tried to fix it the normal way first, before any of this turned into evidence and depositions and and sealed envelopes. I asked Daniel to talk to her. He did. I know he did, because I heard the phone call through the bathroom door, his voice climbing in a way I rarely heard from him, saying, "Mom, you can't say things like that. Not about my wife, not about my daughter." Diane's response, whatever it was, made him go quiet for almost a full minute. When he came out, he wouldn't tell me what she'd said. He just held Luna for a long time and didn't put her down. There was an incident at the pediatrician's office 3 weeks in that I still think about more than almost anything else that happened. Diane had insisted on coming to Luna's 2-week checkup. For support, she'd said, though I understood by then that Diane's version of support usually came with an agenda staple to it. Dr. Renata Kowalski, Luna's pediatrician, had been in practice for over 20 years and had the particular calm of someone who has seen every kind of family walk through her door and stop being surprised by any of them. While Dr. Kowalski was checking Luna's reflexes, Diane leaned over and asked, apropos of absolutely nothing, whether newborn hair color was a reliable indicator of biological parentage. I watched Dr. Kowalski's pen stop moving on the chart. She looked up slowly. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, in the mild, unhurried voice doctors use when they want you to understand they've clocked exactly what you're doing. Hair and skin pigmentation in infants shift substantially in the first year and are influenced by dozens of genetic factors from both sides of a family, expressed unpredictably. It's not something I'd ever use to draw a conclusion about parentage. If you have a genuine medical question, I'm happy to answer it. If this is something else, I'd encourage you to have that conversation outside my exam room. Diane didn't say anything else for the rest of the appointment. I remember feeling, for the first time in weeks, something close to relief. The specific relief of watching someone with actual credentials refuse to let an insinuation slide past unchallenged. It didn't stop Diane. Nothing stopped Diane. Not really. Not until the lab results did. But it was the first crack I saw in her certainty. The first time I watched her recalculate in front of a witness who wasn't afraid of her. I told myself driving home that maybe that would be enough. It wasn't. 2 days later, the group chat message about Caldwell babies arrived, and I understood that Diane didn't back down from being challenged. She just went and found an audience that wouldn't challenge her back. I called an old friend from law school, Priya Anand, who'd since made partner at a family law firm downtown and had spent 9 years untangling exactly this kind of quiet, moneyed cruelty for other people's families. I hadn't called her about my own life before. It felt strange, dialing a lawyer's number about my mother-in-law instead of about a client. Legally, she can't force a test, Priya told me over coffee 2 weeks before the dinner, flipping through the screenshots I'd printed out because I didn't trust myself to just show her my phone and stay calm. She has no standing. Daniel's the father of record. His name goes on the birth certificate whether Diane likes it or not, full stop. But Thea, if this escalates, if she tries anything with custody implications, if she starts making statements that damage your professional reputation, I want documentation. Everything. Dates, times, exact wording. Don't paraphrase her. Save the actual texts. That's when the folder on my laptop stopped being a nervous habit and became something closer to a case file, though I didn't call it that yet, even to myself. I didn't want to believe I needed one. I kept hoping the next conversation with Daniel, the next dinner, the next weekend would be the one where Diane quietly let it go, the way people sometimes do when a rumor doesn't get the reaction it's fishing for. She didn't let it go. She escalated. That's the thing about people who need to be right. Silence doesn't starve them, it just makes them louder. Then Diane announced the dinner. A welcome for Luna, she called it, and she planned it the way she planned everything. A caterer, a florist, 14 place settings, her sister flown in from Charleston. I should have known a woman who needed 14 witnesses for a welcome wasn't planning a welcome. She was planning a verdict, and she wanted an audience for the reading. She waited until the plates were cleared. She stood at the head of the table, Robert's old seat technically, though nobody sat there anymore, except apparently Diane, when she needed the height of it, and she looked directly at me. "No test, no name," she said. "That's how blood works, Thea. I won't have a Caldwell name go on a birth certificate that might not belong to a Caldwell." 14 people went silent. Somewhere down the table, Brooke's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and I could see the anticipation on her face, the way you can see it on someone who's been waiting a long time for a particular fireworks show. I picked up my coffee. I took a sip. I let the room hold its breath for exactly as long as it needed to. "Fine," I said. "Let's test the blood." Diane blinked. That wasn't the answer she wanted, and I watched her recalibrate in real time, the way people do when the script goes sideways on them. She'd built the whole evening around my refusal, around me crying, or storming out, or Daniel having to choose between us at his mother's table. She hadn't built a version where I said yes. "I have one condition," I added, setting my cup down. "Since you said our blood, I want a grandparentage panel too. You, me, Luna. Let's find out who's related to who." I watched something flicker behind Diane's eyes. Not fear, not yet. Just confusion. The small kind. The kind that comes before you realize you've agreed to something you didn't fully understand. "Fine," she said, chin lifting. "I have nothing to hide. Neither did I. That was the difference between us. Though it would take 3 more weeks for either of us to find out how much it mattered. I need to back up, because the dinner wasn't actually the turning point. The turning point happened 4 days before it, and it happened by accident. Daniel's family kept a group chat, Caldwell fam, complete with a photo of the 4 of them at Robert's retirement party as the header image. I wasn't in it. I'd never been added, which I'd noticed and never mentioned, because some hills aren't worth dying on when you're newly married into old money. But Daniel's phone had synced to our shared iPad for something completely unrelated, a grocery list app, of all things. And one night, scrolling for the app, I saw the notification banner instead. I want to tell you I closed it immediately. I didn't. I read 6 months of messages I was never meant to see, and I'm not going to apologize for it, because what I found in there explained everything that happened afterward. There was a message from Diane in December, 4 months before Luna was born. Caldwell babies look a certain way. Robert's mother used to say you could pick one out of a hospital nursery blindfolded. Brooke had responded with a laughing emoji. Daniel hadn't responded at all. And then, buried 3 months before that, August, back when I was barely 6 weeks along and hadn't even told Diane yet, there was this, from Diane to Brooke, no context, no explanation. I don't know why Danny turned out the way he did. He never favored Robert, not once. But that boy is mine and I'll protect this line. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, sitting on the edge of our bed at 11 at night with the iPad glowing in my lap, and something in my genetic counselor brain, the part of me that's spent a career noticing the small inconsistency that unravels a whole family history, sat up straight. He never favored Robert, not once. That's not a sentence you write about your own son unless it's been sitting in you for decades, unless you've spent 30-some years quietly measuring your child against a man's face and coming up short and never telling anyone why it bothered you so much. Quick pause. If you want more stories like this in better quality, my Spotify's linked in the description. I didn't say anything to Daniel that night. I didn't have proof of anything, just a sentence. And a sentence isn't a fact, it's a thread. And I've learned in 12 years of this work that you pull threads carefully or you don't pull them at all. I sat with it instead, running it through the same clinical distance I use with patients, trying to strip the hurt out of it and just look at the shape of the words. He never favored Robert, not once. Not, he doesn't look like his father. Not, people say he takes after your side. A flat, final observation, filed away and never spoken aloud to the one person it was actually about. I thought about all the years I'd watched Diane search Daniel's face at holidays, comparing him against a photograph of Robert at the same age that sat on the mantle, and I'd always assumed she was looking for pride. I wondered for the first time if she'd actually been looking for reassurance, and never finding it, and never understanding why. But I called someone the next morning. Dr. Naomi Hartley had been my colleague at the genetics clinic for 9 years before she left to run her own independent lab. Hartley Diagnostics, fully accredited, chain of custody certified, the kind of lab that gets called into custody disputes and immigration cases precisely because nobody can challenge its results in court. If Diane wanted a test, I was going to make sure it was a test nobody could argue with afterward. Not Diane, not a judge, not anyone. You want a paternity panel and a grandparentage panel run simultaneously? Naomi said when I called her, laying it out. That's not standard, Thea. What are you actually looking for? I don't know yet, I told her honestly, but I think Diane's about to find out something she didn't ask for. Naomi had been in forensic and diagnostic genetics for 15 years by then, the last 4 running her own lab out of a converted office park off Route 9, and she'd testified as an expert witness in enough contested cases to know exactly how to build a result that couldn't be picked apart later by an angry family member with a good lawyer. She walked me through what she'd need. Buccal swabs from all 3 of us, collected under witness chain of custody protocol, photo ID verification at intake, sample split and independently run against 2 separate reference databases, so the result could be cross-validated if anyone ever challenged it in court. If there's something real here, she told me, I want it airtight before anyone in that family gets a chance to say the word contaminated. I appreciated, more than I could say at the time, that she never once asked me if I was doing this out of spite. She just asked me what I needed to be sure. The swabs were collected on a Monday morning, 10 days after the dinner, in a private room at the hospital that Naomi had arranged specifically so there'd be no argument later about where or how the samples were taken. A hospital notary sat in the corner with a clipboard, initialing each bagged swab as it was sealed, logging the time down to the minute, 9:14 a.m., 9:16 a.m., 9:19 a.m., because Naomi wanted a record so precise that no one could later claim a mix-up, a delay, an opportunity for tampering. Diane arrived in her pearls. She always wore the pearls, I understood by then, the way some people wear a badge, and she called the whole thing the right thing to do for the family, loudly, to the intake nurse, as if she needed a witness to her own righteousness. She signed the consent forms with a flourish, like she was signing a contract she'd already won. I watched her swab her own cheek with the calm satisfaction of a woman who has never once doubted the outcome of a test in her life. I didn't say anything. I'd learned, over 3 years, that Diane heard silence as weakness, and I had started to understand that letting her believe that, right up until the moment it stopped being true, was worth more than any argument I could make at that table. Daniel's hands weren't as steady as Diane's when it was his turn. I noticed, and I reached over and held his other hand while the technician worked, and neither of us said anything about why. 10 days later, Naomi called and asked us all to come in, Diane, Daniel, Brooke, and me, to a small conference room on the 3rd floor of the hospital, the kind with a laminate table and a box of tissues placed a little too deliberately in the center of it. Diane sat at the head of the table, pearls on, spine straight, and I watched her rehearsing something behind her eyes, a victory speech. I could see it forming in the set of her jaw. "This baby can't be our blood," she said again, before Naomi had even sat down, cold, flat, a verdict she'd already delivered once, and was simply reading back into the record. The door opened. Naomi walked in with a sealed envelope, and behind her, close enough that I noticed but Diane didn't yet, a woman in a gray blazer I recognized from the hospital's legal affairs office. A woman Naomi had quietly asked to sit in as a witness, given what she'd told me she suspected the results might show. "Actually," Naomi said, taking a seat, "there's something you need to know." She laid 2 reports on the table, side by side, and I watched Diane's eyes go to them the way a hawk's eyes go to movement in grass. "Paternity index greater than 1 million, Naomi read, calm and clinical, the voice she used with families who needed the truth delivered without drama attached to it. "Daniel is Luna's biological father. There is no ambiguity in this result. None." Diane's chin lifted an inch, already moving moving toward her next line. Fine, but the grandmother panel? Diane Caldwell is excluded as Luna's biological grandmother, Naomi said, cutting gently but firmly through the sentence Diane hadn't finished. Probability of a grandparental relationship, less than 0.01%. The room stopped breathing. I mean that literally. I heard Brooke's inhale catch somewhere in her throat and just stay there. That's impossible, Diane said, and for the first time in 4 years, I heard something in her voice that wasn't certainty. If Danny is the father, then I'm the grandmother. That's how it works. I stood up. My hands weren't shaking, which surprised me because I'd expected them to be. My voice came out steadier than I felt. The test confirmed Luna is Daniel's daughter, I said. That means I was faithful. There was never an affair, Diane. Not with anyone. I let that land in the room for a second. Let it sit on Brooke, on Daniel, on the space where the whisper campaign had lived for months. Then I kept going, because the second half was harder, and it deserved to be said carefully. But the grandparentage test also showed you are not biologically related to Daniel. Diane's face went the color of the laminate table. My pulse was loud in my own ears by then. I hadn't let myself feel it until that exact second. Not in the 10 days of waiting for results, not in the parking garage, not lying awake at 2:47 a.m., running the numbers in my head the way I used to run them for patients 12 years ago, back when it was somebody else's family on the other side of the desk. Now it was mine. My hands were steady on the outside. Underneath the table, out of sight, they weren't. Grayson County General, 1986, I said quietly. I'd asked Naomi to pull the historical context the day the anomaly first showed up in the preliminary numbers, because a result like that doesn't happen in a vacuum, and I wanted an answer, not just a shock. Small hospital, understaffed even then. One labor and delivery nurse covering the floor most nights that year, according to state licensing records. Handwritten wristbands, no barcode system. That technology didn't reach rural Georgia hospitals until the mid-90s. The genetic findings are consistent with a newborn identification error. It happened more than people want to admit in hospitals like that, in that decade. You're right, Diane, I said, and I meant it gently, even though gentle wasn't what she deserved after 4 years of Wilsey. She isn't your blood. I paused because I needed her to actually hear the next part, not just brace for it. Neither is he. Diane shot to her feet so fast her chair slammed into the wall behind her, the sound sharp enough that the woman from legal affairs flinched. That's a lie, Diane said, and her voice had climbed into a register I'd never heard from her. Not the cool, measured tone she used to dissect people at dinner tables, but something raw and cracking underneath it. That lab is wrong. You work at this hospital? You could have done anything? Switched anything? I don't work at Hartley Diagnostics, Diane, I said. I never have. Dr. Hartley ran this independently, with a court-defensible chain of custody, precisely because I anticipated you'd say exactly that. The results are not in dispute, Naomi said, calm as ever, sliding a third document across the table. The chain of custody log, every signature, every timestamp, every hand the samples had passed through, none of them mine. Diane turned to Daniel. Her eyes were wet now, her jaw rigid with the effort of holding something back that I don't think she'd ever had to hold back in her life. Tell them I'm your mother, she said. Tell them, Danny. Daniel had been quiet the whole meeting, which I understood, because there wasn't a version of this conversation where he got to speak first. He looked at her now, and I watched 39 years of a relationship rearrange itself behind his eyes in real time. You are my mother, he said, and his voice cracked, but didn't break. You raised me. I'm not arguing with that. I'm never going to argue with that. Then tell her to throw those results in the trash, Diane said. Tell her this doesn't leave this room. I can't, Mom, Daniel said, because they're true. Diane looked around the room she'd built, the table she'd chosen, the pearls she'd worn like evidence, the audience she'd assembled to watch me lose. Every light in that room she had pointed at me, and now every one of them had swung around to land on her instead. She reached up with both hands, and I watched her fingers find the clasp of the pearls at the back of her neck, the ones only for blood, the ones 4 generations of Caldwell women had worn before her, and she undid it. She set them on the laminate table with a single quiet click, the sound somehow louder than everything else that had happened in that room in the last 10 minutes. This is your fault, she said to me. I met her eyes. I didn't feel triumphant, which also surprised me. I felt mostly tired, the specific tiredness of a person who has spent months being underestimated and has finally stopped needing to prove why that was a mistake. I only answered the question you asked, I said. Here's what I didn't put in that conference room, because it wasn't the moment for it, and because some things you say to a person's face and some things you let a professional say for you in a follow-up letter. Naomi's lab flagged the anomaly to the state's Vital Records Office as a matter of protocol, not to punish anyone, just because a documented hospital identification error from 1986 involving a still-living individual is the kind of thing that triggers a review, whether or not the family involved wants it to. Grayson County General had closed in 2003, folded into a larger regional system, its old paper records digitized only partially. 2 weeks after our meeting, a records archivist confirmed what the genetics already told us. On the night Diane's mother, then 26 years old and delivering her first and only child, had given birth, there had been exactly one other newborn girl in the nursery whose family's last name started with the same letter. Wristbands, handwriting, a tired nurse at 3 in the morning. It wasn't a scandal. It was a mistake, 38 years old, that nobody had ever had reason to look for until Diane demanded a test on a baby she'd already decided wasn't hers. Priya, the lawyer I'd brought in weeks earlier just in case, sent a short follow-up letter to Diane's estate attorney once the dust settled. Not a threat, just a clarification, on the record, that Luna's birth certificate and Daniel's paternity were not now, nor had they ever been, in legitimate dispute, and that any further public statements suggesting otherwise could constitute constitute defamation. Diane's attorney, a soft-spoken man named Elliot Sarnoff who'd handled Caldwell family affairs for 2 decades, apparently called Diane the same afternoon the letter arrived. I don't know what he said to her. I know she didn't bring up a DNA test again, to anyone, ever. The story didn't stay contained to that conference room, of course. Nothing does in a county that small, with a family that visible. Brooke, who'd spent months feeding the affair rumor to anyone who'd listen, went quiet in a different way than the room had gone quiet. The way people go quiet when they realize the story they've been telling has just been rewritten out from under them, and not in their favor. I heard secondhand that she'd told a mutual friend she felt sick about the things she'd said. I believe her. I also noticed she never said them to me directly. The county's social circuit, the one that had quietly absorbed the whisper campaign for months without ever needing my side of it, absorbed the correction just as quietly and just as fast. Diane's sister flew back to Charleston early. The dinner invitations that used to arrive addressed to Daniel and Diane started arriving as Daniel and Thea instead, which felt like a small, petty kind of vindication. And I'm not going to pretend it didn't feel good. Diane didn't come to the house for 6 weeks. When she finally did, she came without the pearls. I won't pretend the ending is neat, because it isn't. And I think stories that promise you neat endings about family are usually lying to you somewhere in the middle. Diane is still Luna's grandmother, in every way that actually matters. Daniel made that clear to her the day the results came in, and he's made it clear every day since. She raised him, she loves him, and DNA never had the final word on that. Not really. Not once you strip away the 4 generations of Hurls and the only for blood nonsense she built her whole identity around. What the test actually did was take the one weapon she'd been holding over my head for 4 years and turn it around so she had to hold it too. She apologized to me eventually. Not in a conference room, not in front of 14 witnesses, just in my kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon. Luna asleep in the next room, Diane's hands wrapped around a mug of tea she didn't drink. It wasn't a good apology. It was stiff, and it circled around the actual words for a while before it landed on them, but it landed. I spent my whole life being told what blood meant, she said, staring at the tea, and it turns out I never even knew what mine was. I didn't have a clever answer for that one. I just nodded and let it sit there between us, because some things don't need a genetic counselor's translation. They just need somebody willing to sit in the room while you say them. Luna is 8 months old now. She has her father's laugh and my mother's cheekbones and a stubborn streak that, as far as I can tell, belongs to absolutely nobody but herself. Diane holds her differently these days. Not measuring her anymore, just holding her, the way you hold something you've stopped needing to justify. A year from the night of that dinner, almost to the day, Diane hosted another one. Same house, same dining room, far fewer place settings this time. Just us, Brooke, and a family friend or two. No caterer flown in for effect, no rehearsed opening line. Somewhere between the main course and dessert, Diane stood up, out of habit, I think. The way people who've given speeches their whole lives can't quite sit through a meal without eventually rising to say something. And I felt my whole body brace before I could stop it. She didn't say anything about blood. She raised her glass, looked at Luna asleep in the portable bassinet in the corner, and said she was grateful to have a granddaughter who reminded her, every single day, that family was a thing you built, not just a thing you inherited. It wasn't a perfect apology. I don't think Diane has a perfect apology in her, not after a lifetime of believing pearls could settle arguments that words couldn't. But it was true, and it was hers, and I let it be enough. I keep the 2 lab reports in a drawer in my office at the clinic, not because I need them anymore, but because 12 years of this work has taught me that some documents are worth keeping even after the argument they settled is long over. Every so often, a patient sits across from me, scared of what a test might tell them about who they really belong to, and I think about that conference room, and Diane's pearls sitting on the laminate table with a single quiet click, and I tell them the same thing I eventually understood myself. The results can only tell you where you came from. They were never going to be the ones who decided who gets to love you.